Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Well, welcome back to another exciting episode of NucleCast. Today, I have a very special guest. Some of you may remember, especially those of you Air Force folks, you may remember Nicholas Chaillan, who served as the Air Force's very first Chief Software Officer. Of course, he is now the founder of Learn with Nick, and he is a fellow podcaster and host in the Nick of Time. Nice play on words, Nick. So welcome into NucleCast.
Thanks for having me. Very excited.
So as we talked about before the show, I wanted to, given your background in the cyber world, I wanted to talk to you about the development of a new NC3 architecture. We're moving from analog systems that still require floppy disks, and we're moving to a fully digital architecture. And there are many folks who say, how do we do this? How do we make sure it's secure? They've seen the hacking that takes both place in government, whether it's the OPM hack or the DoD hack, or whether it's the hack of the gas pipelines, the ransomware attacks. There's been a lot going on. And so folks are justifiably concerned, can we secure a future NC3 system? And I couldn't think who better than you to come on to talk about that.
Yeah, it is a very complex problem, no doubt.
So as you think about it, having spent time with the Air Force, and you think about the problem, how do you broadly categorize this problem and then think about solutions to it?
Well, definitely what you're going to see here is obviously we are modernizing NC3, and at the same time, what you realize is that the teams managing and maintaining a lot of these systems have been doing this for many years in the legacy systems, and they have yet to see even basic things like TCP/IP and modern Linux operating systems, and so it is a massive lift to get to where they want to be. Obviously, at the same time, people argue that the more legacy we stick to, the more secure we would be, because people would not be able to figure out a way to get into the systems, which is true and not true. Obviously, the air-gapped component of the security is essential. At the same time, we've been connecting systems and creating this JADC2, join all domain command and control ecosystem, and that's opening the door to malicious actors potentially getting into some of these critical systems. And so I think at the end of the day, we want to use best of breed, and we tried to do that and started in the Air Force with the program GBSD, which is modernizing all the ground nuclear systems, and we were able to start bringing modern technologies and things like Kubernetes and containers, and but obviously it was a pretty big lift to even educate the assessment teams and the T&E teams to be able to understand what's going on, and honestly, it's going to be a training issue, but it's also going to be a pretty heavy discussion with NSA and really getting down to how do we end up securing these systems.
Now, as you think about that very question of securing systems, what comes to mind for you as far as sort of a broad solution? I participated in some of the JADC2 work, and I was sort of concerned about how the development was going and this sort of off-the-shelf app model that it seemed to be driving towards. And some of the interoperability to me seemed to open us up to quite a bit of opportunity for malicious actors, as you said. And since we commingle nuclear command and control systems with conventional command and control systems, how do we secure our NC3 architecture?
Well, I can tell you for sure that moving to a JetC2 ecosystem without having that zero trust baked-in security would be completely criminal. Effectively, you're giving the keys to the kingdom to China and Russia. Connecting these systems that were designed not to be connected whatsoever obviously will be very challenging. Just as simple things as managing identities of these systems to know who is who and who is connecting to what and how. If you look at an F-35 talking to an F-22 and then connecting maybe to a command and control and having a satellite push imagery to the C2 and then be able to analyze the imagery using AI machine learning to augment the data to find objects on there and then be able to have humans decide to shoot whatever target on there. All these kind of kill chain examples require from the get-go strong identities, short-lived identities that can be secure and well guarded to make sure that there's no third-party asset that managed to pretend to be something else and end up connecting to the ecosystem. And then, of course, you have the aspect of zero trust. What should be able to talk to what and how do you reduce the attack surface if you start just connecting everything together, just like an all-day VPN? You would end up opening an attack surface that would be tremendous and quite honestly would be very damaging to national security.
Now, you mentioned zero trust architecture, and as I understand it, and correct me and explain for the audience because they may not understand it very well. In the ZTA, there is sort of one central node that controls all of the trust, and that it's the dispersed nodes where there is zero trust. Is that an accurate explanation of how it works?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of maturity there in terms of different layers of technology, but effectively what you're going to find is what we call a policy enforcement point that's deciding who gets access to what and how based on different conditions. And the key of the capability we built for the Air Force and Space Force, which was, by the way, the largest implementation of zero trust in the world back 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago now. You're going to find both the enforcement of the user identity, whether it's a human or if it's a system, but also the enforcement of the device being used. So if you use a personal device or if you use a government furnished equipment device, that will be a different outcome. And of course, depending on the classification levels, you could say, hey, if I use a CIPR laptop, then I get access to CIPR data. But if I'm on my personal cell phone, I only get access to impact level 2 data. And then maybe if I'm on the Mayan class GFE laptop, I get access to CUI. But again, the policy enforcement point is there to enforce what you get to see, and what's essential here is the concept of a software-defined parameter, which is effectively a fancy way to say each combination of device and user gives you access to a dedicated network, which effectively does not enable you to scan the network to find assets that you're not supposed to have access to. And so that limits the attack surface, unlike a VPN where you could effectively scan the entire network and find assets you're not even supposed to know exist. In this use case, the zero trust architecture enforces and creates a dynamic on-demand network per user/device pair to then be able to give access to things. And the policy enforcement point is centralized, but that doesn't mean it becomes a massive bottleneck. That's kind of the issue you're going to be facing with DoD. People love to centralize and create bottlenecks, but the way we implemented it in the Air Force and Space Force was a complete decentralization of the policies, right? So while you have a centralized enforcement point, you delegate down to the data owner who decides who gets access to what for their data. And so you remove that bottleneck, and that PEP, policy enforcement point stack, can be decentralized, meaning it can be distributed at the edge. So let's say you have an implementation in Paycom, you could go disconnected for a while because of no internet access or whatever, or no connectivity whatsoever, and you can still have access to the local cache of the policies, so you can still do business while being disconnected, and then connect back, right, and resynchronize. So now you have access back to the live policy access. And so, people get worried about, the fact that, a policy enforcement point is centralized, but it can be distributed, right? So it's a centralized enforcement point, but it's distributed at the edge and across networks, but also across cloud providers as well. And it's enforcing the same way with the same capabilities across all these environments. So you have no drift between classification levels.
Yeah, I guess my question was just thinking about Chinese efforts, because if I'm the Chinese or the Russians and I'm thinking about conflict with the United States, the first thing I'm gonna do is launch cyber attacks pre any kind of kinetic conflict. And so I would attack command and control. That'd be the first thing I do, and then I'd try to blind the United States in space. And so I'd wonder, like with these PPs, will that offer sort of a centralized hub for Russians or Chinese to try to attack command and control in the future?
Well, definitely, I guess, in the sense of the policy enforcement point becoming your crown jewel, just like your identity management stack, right? The same way, if a malicious actor were to gain access to our identity management stack and be able to create fake identities or get access to existing identities or change, access control to those identities, obviously the damages will be tremendous. I guess in this use case, the policy enforcement point becomes also part of your crown jewel. There's a few things like that, right? That really should be very well guarded. That's why I even argued during the JEDC2 discussions that we should not let each duty service do their own things in vacuums, because the fact is, if you want to implement zero trust, you cannot be blindly trusting a federated policy enforcement point from the Navy or the Army or the Fourth Estate, because now you're effectively trusting without zero trust. And so having a centralized stack, right, is so essential. And it does become part of your crown jewel, but just like the White House, it's a crown jewel for the president. And if you talk to Secret Service, they're going to tell you it's much easier to secure one house than having a bunch of them. And there's a whole debate about that in security, right? Is it better to have a bunch of them distributed? Is it just easier to have one stack and protect it? My take in this kind of stuff, there's very few things that needs to be centralized and enterprise driven. And identity management is one, and policy enforcement point is clearly the second, because you want to have the same enforcement across every systems. And if you let people do things in vacuums, you're going to have different level of maturity, and all the stuff we just talked about. If you look at where the Air Force and Space Force is when I left, and still today, we were way far ahead from everybody else. And so why would people not want to use best of breed? And why would we, build stuff in vacuums, which effectively lower security because of the lack of maturity of the other teams and implementations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and as I talk to folks who are working these issues, and I ask, have you figured out what the solution is? And of course, the answer is no. And so if you were sitting there with everybody trying to think through, how do I build the next NC3 architecture, what would you tell them? What would you advise them?
Well, I think we really have to embrace the modern cyber principles. There's a few key, what I call the key pillars of cybersecurity today, which is one is moving target defense. So moving target defense means that everything is short-lived. In Platform 1, which is the DevSecOps stack of the Air Force and Space Force and the rest of DoD now, what we managed to do is, kill the software every 4 hours using containers, so it resets itself. So if a malicious actor get access or get a foothold in one of the containers, it goes back to immutable state. And so you always reset, every 4 hours. And so it's kind of an enforcement of immutability. And so moving target defense is essential. That's the same thing for identity management, right? If you have short-lived identities for systems to talk to each other and people to access systems, so not just person entity, but non-person entity, meaning systems talking to other systems, you drastically reduce the ability of a malicious actor get access to a key or get access to an identity to use it to laterally move to the crown jewels. And so having these to be short-lived is essential. And then, of course, you have zero trust, which will drastically reduce your attack surface by creating this dynamic network based on who the person is or the system is and the state of the device being used. If it's patched, if it's up to date, where it's located. We have geofencing. We have a time of day. You could create a lot of different enforcement rules to limit who gets access to what and when. And then we have continuous monitoring with behavior prevention, which is effectively looking at the runtime of the system continuously 24/7 and looking for drift. Platform 1 has a capability where if a container starts running commands or running something it's never done before, it will kill the container and go back to immutable state to then alert the cyber teams as well. So for a malicious actor, to get into the system and retain access and laterally move, if you add all these three things together, you get that centralized logging and telemetry and alerting, so you know exactly what's going on and when. But you also get this enforcement layer, and the other piece that's so essential in modern capabilities like this is the DevSecOps capabilities. When we built Platform 1, having the same orchestration stack and the same platform to see how the software is going to be running and the networking is going to be whitelisted and the traffic will be tracked and the logs will be centralized and the telemetry flowing and all the enforcement points being the same across all these environments. That gives you effectively the ability to focus your cybersecurity teams on one orchestration stack and enforce it across the entire stack. I have a video on YouTube where we explain why Kubernetes is a must in modern systems, including when you think it's overkill. And we demonstrated that on jets and bombers and other systems because of the cyber benefits alone, let alone the velocity and the ability to move fast and move at a pace of relevance. And in this case, it's really a cyber benefit. And so people that care about cyber and argue that cyber is the most important thing in this use case, which I agree it is, then you would want to have all these things baked in, and it cannot be an afterthought. So you have to go back to being enabling the teams to have this as a foundation of doing business.
Well, we're about midway through the show, so we're going to take a quick break. We're with Nicholas Chaillan, and we'll be right back. This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the 15th Annual Nuclear Deterrence Summit. Come join Nuclecast at the summit on February 13th through 15th, 2023 at the Hyatt Regency Crystal City, Arlington, Virginia. Industry and government experts will be discussing management of the nuclear security complex, stewardship of the nuclear stockpile, arms control negotiations, and strategic policy. Stop by the Nuclecast booth to say hello. Executive producer Kimberly Charrington and I will be there interviewing guests for upcoming episodes. You can find a registration link to the Nuclear Deterrence Summit with a 15% discount on the Nuclecast website at nydeter.org/Nuclecast. All right, you're listening to Nuclecast. Of course, I'm Adam Lowther, your host, and we're talking with Nicholas Chaillan, the former Chief Software Officer of the United States Air Force, and clearly one of the brightest guys in the cyber world right now. And we were talking about the NC3 architecture and how do we secure this new architecture. Now, could you take a step back and explain for some of the listeners who may not be familiar, DevSecOps? What is it and how is it being implemented to what end in the DoD?
Yeah, DevSecOps is really the most important enablers of success. People that don't use DevSecOps in 2023, let alone 2022, clearly you will not have a chance of being able to move at the pace of relevance. And it enables a few things. One, it removes bottlenecks and walls between development teams, cyber teams, and operation teams so that your software is not being built in a vacuum. You have rapid feedback, in production from the end users, the warfighters, to know exactly if what you're building makes sense. You can release software multiple times a day, including, in very complex systems, because it's very small incremental delivery of value. Instead of doing these massive 5-year releases, you're going to cut it into very small pieces. And, a good example of that is SpaceX that can update software, an hour before the launch. And, people argue, well, SpaceX had issues back in the day, but none of these issues were software related. It was always hardware issues. And honestly, the velocity of enabling the teams to update the rocket before the launch has been probably why they were able to also avoid many software issues along the way, and they just achieved a massive number of launches. I think it was 60 launches last year, more than pretty much anybody can do. And that tells you, that velocity and that ability to compete and keep up, even for the DoD, we don't realize sometimes, and we like to forget it. But the fact is we're competing against China. I'm not going to mention Russia too much anymore, but I would say, China is definitely leading in hypersonic and quantum compute, AI, machine learning, and different things. And so every enabler that's going to enable your teams to remove bottlenecks. The first one, obviously, has been massive for us in the Air Force and Space Force, has been the continuous authority to operate, the c-ATO, which gives you the ability to continuously release software multiple times a day. Platform 1 is up to 21 times a day per program now, which is a massive number for DoD. We're not at Facebook levels, but that's okay. And the velocity you get there and the ability to automate your ATO process is game changing. In fact, in 1 year doing DevSecOps back in 2019, we saved 100 years of time. So that's time that we say saved, but I would argue maybe we just didn't waste it, right? Because that's the whole debate.
Yeah.
Are we, if others are not wasting the time, then it's not saving, it's wasting, right?
Yeah. So you said this idea of brief periods of trust, of identities, of your bins. What else do you think needs to be incorporated into a new NC3 architecture?
Well, what was interesting was the fact that if you look at SpaceX, again, I'm going to use them because quite honestly, when we talk to people, using example like Netflix, they say, oh, we don't do a freaking, video app, right? And I get it, right? It's true. But when you use SpaceX as an example, you're pretty close to the DoD mission there, right? So,
sure.
Whether it's with a nuclear silo on top or not, I mean, sure, it adds suddenly an additional level of issues, but the fact is, it's life and death too. So, I think it's a good example. So with SpaceX, what they were able to do is use commercial hardware and more importantly, commercial open source software stacks. And I know a lot of people are going to freak out about this, but the fact is being able to use best of breed open source capabilities like Linux, not have to rely on secret sauce real-time OS systems that have very limited set of applications around that. It's not just about the operating system itself. It's about all the tools, the development tools, the testing tools, the automation tools, the cyber tools, the runtime tools. All these are very limited when you're going to go after very closed IP companies that just do DoD stuff for a living. And so you're very limited in options, right? And capabilities. And quite honestly, they're often lagging 10 to 20 years behind what you see on the commercial side. So SpaceX decided to pick, Linux and do a real-time OS patch that they open source to the community. They're using non-space hardware. And by the cost savings and the space savings, they're able to actually put 20 times more hardware. So if something goes wrong with a couple of them, they don't care because there's diversity of options and of numbers of devices. And so it's actually more resilient compared to what they could have done with secret sauce space capabilities. So I think it's kind of the same mindset, right? At the very least, you want to embrace modern capabilities. Open source scare people. I'm not saying you just should pick whatever open source capabilities and hope for the best. There is a process to vet and understand, the ecosystem around open source projects. And we do a very poor job. I was pretty shocked to find that, we had no capabilities to assess open source projects whatsoever in the department. No one is actually in charge of vetting any of these projects. In fact, there is no centralized vetting of commercial software as well, which create a massive amount of waste. We were the first one to create, a centralized repository of containers with Iron Bank in Platform 1, which has now 1,000+ containers, both from open source and commercial products, to centrally vet them and scan them and see and understand the risk and provide it back to DoD programs to use. That should be the only way to do business, right? So I think back to your point, the NC3 community should really embrace that centralized mindset and work on accrediting software and components as a whole instead of doing it per program and per engagement. We see the Navy doing things in vacuums. We see the Air Force doing it in vacuums, right? So the more we can partner in the NC3 community and merge, and people freak out when we reuse stuff across programs because they feel like it's a security risk. But I would argue, with the lack of talent and the complexity of the systems we build, quite honestly, not doing it is actually more risky because, quite honestly, the teams are not very good at doing it and assessing risk of this software. And so you're going to have different teams assessing the same software 20 million times. Often that leads you to being so far behind in releases, right? 5, 6, 7, 10 years behind in releases. You want to use some component, you're stuck with a version from 2010 or 2000. That creates risk, right? And having the ability to centrally assess and understand risk and updates dependencies to make sure we're not stuck in time, that's as important, right? Timeliness and security in cyber is as important as doing proper assessments. And if you're creating bottlenecks, you're creating risks.
Now, you mentioned one of the things that I sort of my ears perked up in, this idea of being able to scan and vet software that may be, maybe it's off the shelf software for something, because that is clearly one of the big concerns is how do we effectively vet this software that we may be considering for integration into, because the NC3 system, it's a system of systems with more than 100 individual systems that are all brought together. Can we effectively vet and then patch software that we may want to bring into a new architecture?
Well, if we start centralizing that work, yes. But if we keep doing it in vacuums per team, and every of these systems are reassessing the same bits of software, that's where you're going to fail, right? And it's why we're failing. And that's why we're stuck in time. And we feel it's actually, and there's this mentality in DoD, but particularly in the NC3 community to, have this black box and feel safe. When we brought the F-35 SAP, box at the Black Hat, the hacker conference, they got it in 3 minutes, and it was supposed to be the thing that no one even heard about, and using special secret sauce DoD stuff that no one else is using. Guess what? Didn't stop them from getting in and control the box in minutes. So this idea of black box and putting our hand in the sand and hiding stuff, honestly, the best security is when you can be, I'm not going to say open, but as open as possible, and still feel safe, right? And know that you've done your job to secure the system and have multiple layers of defense. And at the end of the day, I'm not saying we should just be open and open everything, but the fact is, when you just rely on opacity and black boxes to be secure, that's when you're not.
Yeah, it's a good point. So as we end the show, because we're about out of time, if you were to leave the leadership of the Air Force, the leadership, perhaps corporate leadership that's building these new systems, what would you say to them? What would be your your drop the mic and walk out the door moment on NC3?
Well, the issue we're facing is these systems get upgraded every 50, 70 years, right? And so there's a tendency already to be cautious, overly cautious. And now you're effectively building today software using already 20 years old technologies. We can't afford to do this anymore, right? Just in terms of cybersecurity, what we find is, malicious actors will be able to find ways to get into systems we don't even comprehend yet through AI and machine learning. I've been working on a chat GPT bot, and it can do things you wouldn't believe. It's just the human cannot even comprehend what the AI is able to come up with. And so I think the next generation of malicious actors are going to be robots, right? And empowered, through automation. So I think we have to be very cautious in not building the system that's going to last for another, 50, 70 years with already 20-year-old tech stacks. You're compounding the problem. And so, we're going to have to go a little bit outside of the comfort zone, and often it's going to be a first, right, for these teams to use the technology, which creates a little bit less lift. And, they're going to say, oh, it's too risky, right, because we don't know enough about it. But maybe not doing it is actually a bigger risk. They just don't understand it yet, right? So I really, recommend first, training and learning, right? Spend an hour a day to learn. Go watch some of our videos on YouTube. It's free. Go check it out. Go outside of your comfort zone. Keep reinventing yourself. I have this tagline: invest in yourself. That's what people don't do enough in IT, right? The velocity of IT is such that you can't get stuck in time, and you get away with it in duty, but it doesn't mean you should, right?
Yeah.
So again, it goes back down, to people and the leadership. Of course, they're going to say, we want to build the best of breed and be secure and safe. Well, secure and safe for people will automatically mean we're not going to take risk, and we're going to use technologies that are well proven. And by proven, they mean in duty with what we know, which is 20 years old. That's not the answer, right? The answer is proven technologies on the commercial side in industry outside of the defense industrial base, and use best of breed and move forward and keep learning and keep trying things out. Programs cannot be stuck in time anymore, 50, 70 years. We don't have that luxury anymore. So we need to think outside the box.
All right. Well, we'll let that be the last word. I want to thank Nick Chaillan for coming on and talking with us about cybersecurity and NC3. He's the first and former chief software officer, and he's now the founder of Learn with Nick. So check him out online, and I want to thank you for coming, Nick. It was a great talk. I learned something about DevSecOps, so I always appreciate
That's good.
that.
I did my job.
And thank you, the listeners, for listening to the show, and we'll see you next time. Okay, so we just had a conversation with Nicholas Chaillan, IT guy. I spent a year as an information assurance fellow at AFRL up in Rome with Kamal Jabor and his folks, and that really expanded my brain and pushed me in ways I wasn't comfortable. But this conversation did the same thing. So I was listening very carefully and trying to put everything he said in the context of my limited knowledge of cyber. But I think it was really interesting, and I was glad to hear his perspective And there's a variety of perspectives out there, but I was glad to hear his perspective on how do we build a secure NC3 architecture. And so I hope you listen carefully, maybe listen a second time if you didn't understand everything he said, but it was a good show and it was interesting. Hope you enjoyed it.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Grunthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Nucleacast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.